14th annual Percy-Synar Awards ceremony. I'm Eric Schickler, co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies, along with Christina Mora. And it's our pleasure to welcome the award recipients, families, friends, advisors to this great event. Now, IGS started these awards in 2007 to support exemplary graduate and undergraduate student research. Counting this year's recipients, IGS has awarded 62 Synar Awards and 78 Percy Awards. Now, the Mike Synar Graduate Research Fellowship provides outstanding graduate students with a $3,000 research grant, and the Charles H. Percy Undergraduate Grant for Public Affairs Research awards outstanding undergraduates with a $500 research grant. Now, we've always celebrated this event as an in-person event in our library. And in fact, last year's celebration was our very last major event before the pandemic shut down campus. Now, we eagerly look forward to returning next year to do this again in person. But in the meantime, we're really excited to have been able to bring together so many terrific people to celebrate this event today with us virtually. Now, in particular, we're fortunate to be joined by the people responsible for establishing these grants, Bill Brandt and Patrice Bugalis Brandt. They created these fellowships to honor Congressman Mike Synar of Oklahoma, who was Bill's mentor when he first became active in politics and public policy, and to honor their home state senator, Charles Percy of Illinois, for whom Patrice worked as press secretary. Now, I want to just say Bill and Patrice have been tremendous friends to IGS and especially to our students for so many years. They've provided generous support through these grants and other programs that have just allowed so much terrific research to flourish here at Berkeley. We're just very grateful to them for being such steadfast supporters of our students. And so if we were in person, I would applaud them in person, but I just want to again, say how grateful we are to them. And I'm going to turn it over now to Bill, who will tell us a little bit about Mike Synar, and then we'll learn a little bit about Charles Percy following that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I used to, back in 2007, when we started these, spend a great deal of time expounding on Mike Synar and offering a historical version of Mike. That's all been replaced by Google now. So to the extent that I leave anything out, I urge you all to go on Google. There are great stories about Mike Synar. Particularly, you'll find the column by David Broder, who was a legendary person himself and a columnist for the Washington Post, where upon the departure from Mike, from Congress, Broder referred to him as one of the tall trees in Washington for many years and a great loss. Mike indeed was a friend of mine. I don't know if he was as much a mentor as more like a partner in crime, which is probably good that the statute of limitations has run on a lot of our escapades. But in any case, Mike and I would be about the same age. He was born in 1950, just a year younger than I. He was one of the wonder kids of the era. He graduated from law school at the University of Oklahoma in 1977. Just a year later, he was elected to his first term in Congress at the tender age of 28. And so when I was out doing political work, I started as McGovern's field director for the South Side of Chicago in 1972. As I was moving in Democratic circles, it was odd to see someone who was essentially a contemporary who was also a congressman. And so we had a lot of fun together over those years. Mike served for 8 years in Congress. If you do Google him, you will see that because he came from Oklahoma's 2nd District, which is in the northeastern corner of Oklahoma, abutting Fort Smith, Arkansas, he obviously knew Bill Clinton fairly well. They grew up literally 40 miles apart and knew each other well. But Mike also had a strong basis in Congress for dealing with Native American affairs. And you will see that in Google and other places as you look at his legislative accomplishments. And indeed, that to the larger public was what he was known for. Mike and I, however, worked on a number of other issues, and some of them including smoking on airplanes, which is one of the, due to him is one of the reasons you can't smoke on an airplane, he and Senator Durbin of Illinois. I will also tell you that Mike did a lot of work on the bankruptcy and restructuring aspects of this. And with that, he teamed up on the only other person knowledgeable in Congress at that time, which was a Democrat from Alabama, Howell Heflin, who had previously been a Supreme Court justice in Alabama and understood the law. And that's where they sort of grabbed me, because I'm in the restructuring business. So they made me their default policy wonk on restructuring, on bankruptcy and other things. And a good bit of legislation that Mike wrote over the years, especially in the early 90s, actually was written by me at his insistence, and he would pound on me on the judiciary conference table in the House late at night to finish things on time. I always tell the end of the story because I'm coming up to my time. Mike was one of those many Democrats who was ushered out of office 2 years after Bill Clinton was elected, when there was a sort of a great first Democratic revolt and the House really went Republican. Mike was not ushered out by a Republican. Interestingly enough, Oklahoma was turning red. This was an Oklahoma that had some famous Democratic people over the years, such as Carl Albert, who had just been the Speaker of the House. So Oklahoma had a long Democratic tradition, but the state was turning red. So in the Democratic primary, a candidate entered who said that Washington was so corrupt that if he would win, he would not go to Washington. He would serve as a congressman only from Muskogee and never go there. And in fact, he was a strong Christian who believed that God would smite the Congress. And so that was another reason he was running against Mike. Unfortunately, because of the way Oklahoma was going, Mike lost to this very strong Christian conservative, who, by the way, went on later to lose in the general election to the fellow who eventually became Coburn, eventually the senator from Oklahoma. But I always tell the story as I end that I was feeling particularly down after doing a lot for Mike over those in that election in '94. And especially when the Daily Oklahoman, the paper in Oklahoma City, which took great delight in poking at Mike when they could, ran a headline that said, "God defeats Mike Synar," the day after the primary. So seeing that, I felt especially put out, and I called Mike and I said, "Mike, I'm so sorry. How are you feeling?" And he goes, "Not really too bad. I got 48% against God," which of course is a classic politician's way of looking at it, and I think sums up Mike's personality and outlook on life in general. After he left Congress, I helped him land with President Clinton the chairmanship of the National Bankruptcy Commission, which led to a great deal of work on restructuring. He was also the ambassador to the Frequency Convention in Geneva. That sounds like a fairly obtuse issue, but if you think about the late 90s, they were dividing up the radio and television frequencies around the world to accommodate then what were novel. That was cell phone usage and 1G coming on 2G. Mike distinguished himself there. Unfortunately, a couple of years after the primary, he came down with a brain tumor. I was one of his primary caregivers for a number of years. He passed away at a very young age in 1996 and is missed by all. But he was one of those younger people, a true young Turk that left an amazing impact on what he did. Was forever remembered. Obviously, now 25 years after his death, his memory is more on Google than it is among the younger generation. But truly, he set a standard for young activism that I think still applies today. One of the reasons Patrice and I do this is Mike Synar was not measurably older than most of you when he was first elected to Congress. He made a major change in the world, and I'm hoping with these grants for both the Percy and the Synar fellowships that all of you will do the same. And with that, I'll kick it back to Eric, and I thank you so much, Eric, for allowing me to say a few words about Mike Synar. So Eric, are you, well, yes, Patrice, I'm sorry.
I'm supposed to just speak up right here.
I'm not being a product of Hollywood. I haven't followed the script too well, so, but the press secretary always does. So let me turn it over to the press secretary.
First, I should need to clarify, I was the
Sorry about that, Bill. Yeah, no, it's Patrice.
Okay. I'm just, those cue cards, it just doesn't work for me as well as it used to.
My relationship with Senator Charles Percy was not like Bill's with Mike Synar. He was my first out of college boss's boss. When I landed a job in Senator Charles Percy's U.S. Senate office in Chicago. And so I can't speak to him as a person with unique qualities. So I'm so glad his daughter is with us today to talk, because he was a real complicated, exceptional human being. But as a boss, it was quite clear what kind of person he was. His daughter, almost a year ago to the day, as CEO and president of WETA, Public Broadcasting in Washington, D.C., addressed the annual summit of America's public television stations and defined their partnership as a public service mission forged by collaboration and values to keep people informed. Her brief but targeted comments highlighted public media as an essential voice in our democracy today, providing meaningful public service. For over 40 years, Mrs. Rockefeller's work in public broadcasting has been directed at building and creating a trusted and respected broadcasting network that brings people together. Her passion, laser-sharp intelligence, and commitment to service mirror the qualities her father brought to his U.S. Senate office. Against what is now the historical backdrop of